And welcome to today's, I want to say, speaking of reliability, which is, I'd say, way more often than I talk about Ascendo Reliability's webinar program. But welcome to today's Ascendo Reliability webinar event. We're going to talk about reliability maturity. I'm going to do another take on this, a little bit different and than I've talked about in the past with just the mechanics of it and the matrix and stuff like that. And I'm going to put in the chat a link to a page on Ascendo that has the process of reliability engineering book that Carl and I wrote. But more importantly, if you scroll down, you'll find a link to the maturity matrix itself. So it's quite an eye chart if I put it in on a presentation. But if you want to refer to it, it's not going to be central to this, but it might be a good reference. And then also on Ascendo, underneath ebooks, you'll see a reliability maturity ebook, which is free. You need to be logged into the site to download it, which is also free to create an account, which will go into yet another way of thinking through maturity, and it defines a lot of the terms and concepts and stuff like that. But I want to dive into it a little bit different today and see how well this resonates with you. So we'll see how it goes. Now, years and years ago, I got to spend a whole lot of time working with at Hewlett Packard and doing assessments of the reliability programs of all of the various divisions. And there were about 50 altogether. And then since then, I have done another roughly 150, maybe a little bit more, assessments of all kinds of organizations and all kinds of industries. And one of the things I find is that most organizations that are creating products or maintaining or creating a production line of some sort are have some objective, whether it's to ship on time or to satisfy customers or delight customers. And they usually say it in some euphemistic way at the corporate level. And that's great. And when you're working on a particular project, we need to get this widget, to the holiday market by such and such a date. And we have an objective, and it has to be, blue or orange, and it has to be this weight and these set of functions and so on. That's fine. We kind of set an objective and oftentimes many objectives in a requirements document. But then people have to deal with that. We have to figure out, well, which of all of these objectives am I a part of? Am I involved in and have to deal with and work on in one form or another? And what you interpret it as and what I interpret it as and how I focus what I work on maybe is very likely going to be different than what you work on. And that's obvious if you're a mechanical engineer and I'm an electrical engineer. I'm going to say I'm going to work on the circuit boards and you'll work on the case and on the gearbox and stuff like that. We all have a different set of backgrounds and priorities and motivations and all those other things that go into what we bring along with our technical skills to the job. And so those interact and they create a set of collectively as a group, we set a way that we do work. And I'm quite sure all of you have been in organizations that uh, it's just given the meeting won't start until 5 minutes after the hour or 10 minutes after the hour. I was even in one organization where the general manager says, I am tired of waiting for the meeting to start. So I'm going to say, all right, we're going to schedule meetings instead of 9 a.m., they're going to be 9:10. And his name was Huss Tigley, and he called it Tigley time. He said, I need time to move between conference room and conference room to finish up one meeting and get to the next one and get a cup of coffee and so on. So he put a 10-minute gap between meetings just structurally. And it was just the way we did stuff. And then it also reinforced that if the meeting's going to start at 10 after, you better be there and be ready. And meetings happen right on time. And for those of you who've been to more than one or two of these webinars, I tend to start right on the hour. And today I was addressing a side question real quickly and an idea for a future webinar, so I was a bit late, so I apologize for that. But generally, a group of people that are working towards some common objective or set of objectives will create a informal way they work together. And showing up at meetings is one way to is one aspect of that. It might not be a written rule anywhere, but it becomes an expectation. This is the way we do things here. And it may be what's our approach to tolerancing? What's our approach to derating? What's our approach for vendor selection and who's involved with that and so on. And over time, some organizations document those processes and procedures, and especially if they're trying to get certified in some fashion or another. But the idea is that any collection of people that have a ongoing relationship to achieve something will probably set up well, not probably, will set up a set of norms, set of expectations, the way we do what we do. And I'm sure you can think of dozens of ways to recognize that within your own organization. Just recently, we had a roof replacement on the home we live in, and the crew that was working, you could set your clock to their breaks. At 10 o'clock, they took a break for 15 minutes and they were back to work. And then they took a half hour at lunch and they took a break in the afternoon and they cleaned up and they were just a great crew to have working on our property. And they worked hard, but they were very punctual. I mean, it was amazing. But the way they worked together and supported each other and anticipated each other was obvious that they've been working together for a while. And so they had created really an unspoken way of working together. And that's what I mean by norms. So all of those things go into creating a product. Uh, Not necessarily a reliable product, but I was interested in how does reliability actually occur for different groups of people, for different organizations. And so what I found was that these norms, the way we do what we do, really impacted the ability to create a reliable solution in a consistent way. And I'll explain more about that as we go. But for example, when you got to an organization, when the first time you took a job or you took your second or third job or whatever, or you volunteered to work with a committee of some sort or a professional society, whether it's at professional or at home related, um, you probably had to get a sense of how things got done there. In some organizations will give you a great big massive book that says this is how we do stuff, and then you realize very quickly that very few things are actually done that way. More often is, hey, you need to go talk to these five, six people and see what they do and how they can work with you, and what your relationship should be with them, and so on. And you learn the norms very early in your program. And if you bump up against those, if you do something that's not as expected, the way we do stuff, you probably get feedback in multiple different ways. And it behooves us all to pay attention to how things get done. Yes, some things can be done better. There's no doubt about it. Yet it's being aware of how things get done oftentimes is the starting place. So then you recognize where opportunities lie or where gaps are and so on. So that's why I did those assessments, was to learn how these different organizations achieve the reliability results that they did. And I was trying to learn how they did what they did and how they made decisions. All right. Well, how is a culture or a maturity level, and I'm using those relatively interchangeably, but basically it's that set of norms. This is how we do what we do. And part of how that's created is, and you can imagine this in a small group. is there's 4 or 5 people and you meet every morning, you figure out what the priorities are for that day and the progress on stuff, hurdles that you're seeing, and you sort it out together and you go to work. And if something comes up midday, there's only 4 of you, 5 that you have to talk to. It's pretty easy to get in touch and keep everybody up to speed. One team I worked in had over 50 engineers working on it. I lost count of how many managers they had. And they were measuring all kinds of stuff. And they were kind of in that mode of, and I was looking it up as I was preparing for today's event, that adage of you, what's measured can be managed, or you manage what's measured, or something like that. And it's attributed to Peter Drucker, I believe. I think it's Drucker. And yet there's plenty of sites saying, no, he never said that. And there was plenty of our material and editorial saying, and I'm quite sure many of you have run into this, is just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should be measuring it, right? Some of the most important stuff in our organization are things that are very difficult to measure. Engagement, buy-in, support, understanding the level of knowledge and sophistication for whatever technical skills you have, on an ongoing everyday. Are you bringing your A game every single day with every decision? Those things are really hard to measure in an ongoing way. Now, it's really easy to measure what's the cost of this new product we're building because we roll up the bill of material and here's our estimated costs or our committed costs from vendors and suppliers, and we know what it costs. And we can estimate what it costs to manufacture it, how many people it takes, equipment, and so on. The cost is really, really easy to measure. And many organizations pay attention to it because it is important for their business. Others will measure that, are we ready to ship on time? Which is very difficult to measure. So if I ask 5 of you on it working on the same program, are we going to be done by March 3rd? We would each give it some risk factor of some sort, saying, oh yeah, no problem, all the way to no way in hell. And maybe a percentage wise on it and so on. So the program manager is in this vague realm of, are we going to make it on time? And many organizations use a gate system where you say, all right, we're going to have the concepts and select on this, and then we're going to pick key long lead time components. We're going to lock those in, and then we're going to lock the design down, and then we're going to start, doing prototypes in the manufacturing line and on these dates. So you set a bunch of little milestones with the intent that if I hit those milestones successfully, I will hit the milestone to ship on time. So you break it down into hurdles as you go. But those all are tangible-ish things that we can measure. It's and do we have all the functions from our engineering requirements document? Do they all work? Are they all in the design and do they work? We can measure those. But when it comes to reliability or what's the customer's reaction to the quality of the system, as you all know, this gets real vague real quick. Yet that may be as or more important than whether I have the 98th requirement met within the document or not. And so we tend to focus on things that we can measure easily. And I even had one quality engineer or manager tell me is we don't measure reliability because it's difficult. Well, is it important? Oh, yeah, it's terribly important. It's the reason we're losing market share is our reliability isn't any good. Well, it's not good, so you are measuring it. He said, no, our customers are measuring it and telling us. I said, all right, well, maybe you need to figure out how to measure it during your development process so that you can actually achieve the objectives you're actually looking for. And so we worked on how do you go about doing that. But measuring the culture of an organization, it can be done. It's not terribly difficult. It's you get a snapshot when you put your mind to it, and I talk about it in the process of reliability engineering book and the reliability and maturity ebook, which is free. Two different methods for going about doing that, and the intent is that, or the idea here is that the organization's management structure and senior leaders and whoever is you look to say, hey, this is what we need to do, they will emphasize one metric or another, one approach or another, or one idea or another, or concept or tool. Is this a Microsoft shop or is this an Apple shop kind of things? What kind of CAD systems are we using? So on and so on. But it also comes about with what's emphasized in like all hands meetings. What is the top of the topic list that your vice president or general manager talks about? Is it cost? Is it time to market? Is it feature set? Is it competitors? Is it market share? Is it profitability? Those are good clues of what's most important. And if they have 2 minutes at the end of their time and they say, oh, let's get to that question, that may well be just a filler, not obviously not most important because they hadn't talked about it in the last half hour. So it's another very direct way that a culture is created is what's important. And it's a bit muddled though, because there are people that will say safety is very important, and then they'll ignore it all the time in the day-to-day decisions they make. Yet they'll say it's important all day long. It's like saying reliability and quality is very important, right? That's great. What are you doing about it? What decisions have actually been including those concepts? And so it it's what people actually do, is what decisions and what priorities and what gets funded and all of those aspects of creating emphasis on what's important within an organization. And reliability is in this mix at some point or another for every organization, all the way from its first topic, and we're going to talk about it, we're going to measure it, and we're going to track it, and we know it's important to our customers, all the way to we completely ignore it, never talk about it. And whatever the reliability result that we get is what we get. And it might be good, it might not be. And you can imagine the variability and what havoc that causes. Now, many program managers or project managers will deliberately set priorities in that project, and it may change over time, right? One organization I met was making a consumer product, and it was very seasonal. I think twice a year they had a big push to bring out new products. And when I asked her, what are your priorities for the program? And I said, is it time to market or features or cost or reliability? She said, let me be very clear. She said, time to market, time to market, time to market. What were those other things? Because if they weren't on the shelf at the right time, they didn't sell any. And there wasn't any makeup the week afterwards or the 2 weeks afterwards. It was you're there or you're not. And that completely made their business. So all of their decisions, all of their focus was what decision can I make that will not risk being late to market? What decisions can I make that would make it easier for us to get to market? And it was very, very clear across the organization. Where in other organizations, they may have different sets of priorities at different points in time as they go. So the first generation of a new platform might be on the feature sets that it has. And then the second iteration of it might be a cost reduction. And that's okay. It's just an organization works really well when those priorities are very clear all the way through the organization. And I argue, is where does reliability fit into this? Where are the thresholds that if I cut costs to a certain level, I'm going to affect the reliability or quality of the product? What's that threshold? Where is that don't cross line for the adverse effect of its performance over time? And when you're an engineer, the program managers say, all right, time to market is our most important. Okay, what about all of these other things? Time, design for reliability, to design for environment, design for assembly, design for manufacturing, design for X, and on and on and on. And at some point, cost is still important. At some point, the features are still important. At some point, what's in the engineering requirements document are important or not. We need to be very, very clear overall, and that setting of priorities on how well it's communicated and reinforced and emphasized is a big factor in what creates the culture of that organization. By culture, I mean is how we make decisions. We'll get into some of that here. The actions we take, the decisions we make, the vendor we choose, the materials we choose, the approach we choose, whether we focus on analyzing or testing something or not, are all decisions that ultimately aggregate into the reliability performance of your product. Plus its functional features and it's whether it makes it to market or not, whether we can assemble it or not, so on and so on. But we make thousands of decisions. I would argue that's a very low estimate for the number of decisions that a design team puts into creating a new product or system. Every single one of them has a factor that influences reliability. I mean, including how many threads I put on a screw and what kind of torque it would hold. If there's vibration, I might put some feature that would, mitigate the effects of vibration backing that screw out. There's two decisions right there. And that's just one screw, not counting all the other factors that go into what size and what kind of force it has, what tensile strength it has, and so on. Those all affect the reliability performance of the product. And so understanding how people make decisions is the accumulation of what's emphasized, what's the ropes of that organization, how they do what they do, what are the priorities, and that person's what they bring to the table with their experience and background and so on. How that decision actually gets made and how it weighs in and factors the effects of that decision on the reliability performance is what I mean by an assessment, is understanding that whole realm, is understanding how things get done often means how are decisions made. The big ones and the little ones. They all add up to make a product reliable or not. All right. Now, there's all kinds of ways that can be done. I've seen organizations all across the spectrum from they don't even care about reliability and it's just not a factor whatsoever for them in their consciousness at all. They're like, no, we don't do that. To others, where it's the way they run their entire business. So let me pause here for a second. In your organization, if I had to only ask one question, to understand your organization, I would ask, do you anticipate problems? And problems here, I'm referring to quality and reliability type stuff. Do you think through and anticipate those as you plan for a reliability plan or a quality plan or a program plan or whatever you want to call it? And the chat window's open. Carl's got a couple of messages in there, a few at the start we did. And I'm going to put the link to where the book and the matrix is. What do you think? Do you anticipate reliability problems or not? By plan, by what you plan on doing. Okay. So the idea here is that there's two big camps of cultures related to reliability that I've arbitrarily, for lack of any other justification, divided what I've seen on the 200 plus assessments I've done is reactive and proactive. And they're just characteristics of how we do what we do. And part of it is if I'm designing that screw and I'm a good engineer, I intuitively don't want it to fail. And I may consider the load it's under, the conventional styles, design guidelines, types of materials, the environment. And you can see that every one of those things impact whether that fastener will achieve what it's supposed to do. And those decisions, each and every one of them, impact how long it will do that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I found a lot reactive ones, and that's not uncommon, unfortunately. Or it might be a bias of those are the companies that called me for support. But the idea is that when the maturity characteristics, whether you are a reactive organization, which I consider a lower maturity from a reliability maturity point of view, is you get the job done, yet it's in response to things, right? And proactive is being that you're ahead of the game. And we'll describe those in more detail here in a second. But part of it is that it's when you make the decision. If I need to, wait until I have a failure in the field or a failure in a prototype before I take action to invest in improving that design, I'm more reactive, right? I'm waiting until something proves that I need to fix that. Where a proactive stance would say, I'm going to use FMEA and hazard analysis and engineering judgment to say, that uh, design decision needs to be robust enough to avoid the screw backing out, for example. So I'm going to proactively make that decision and put margin there. And if I'm uncertain, I'll line up a way to evaluate it in whether it's simulation or a test. And I make those decisions before it fails. I anticipate the failures. And that's the basics of these two groups. Is one is I wait till something happens and somebody tells me I got to fix it, or I proactively think through what could go wrong and mitigate those before they happen. And the other part of this is then, well, how I make those decisions and who does that? So if you wait until it's a disaster and your customer is complaining to you, they're making the decision for you. You either fix this or I'm not going to be your customer anymore. And as all of you know, that's way more expensive to address that problem than it would have been if you would have anticipated it in the concept phase of your design process. And it might have waited until the quality manager or as a vice president got involved before something gets addressed. Or when you do it early in the concept phase, it may be an engineer or a first level manager that says, no, we need to address these things so that it just works. And you can see that they, the reaction part gives you this spiral effect of where you're reacting to stuff. And then the next day you're afraid to open your email or listen to voicemail because you're going to have 15. I should also include like Slack channels and Teams and everything else that we got. But the idea is that if every day brings a new disaster, you never really have the time to properly solve the previous ones. And that just leads to more problems in a kind of a death spiral kind of realm. Now, some reactive groups are actually really good at reacting. They get to be like a really top-notch emergency team. Yet, there's only so far you can go with that before you just really burn the whole team out. It's not a fun place to work. And then consider that there's lots of variability. Some things you're going to react to and some you won't. Yet the thing that's urgent often takes precedence. And so the things that you know are important that you could be proactive on, but when you have a whole calendar full of important or urgent things, immediate disasters that need to be solved, it's really hard to do the important stuff to avoid them. And so when I'm working with an organization to understand what they do and don't do, I'm looking at how they make decisions. I'm looking at what factors are considered, what are the priorities to it, and so on. And if it's all hands on deck, the vice president is flying in to take over this program, and our production line is down. Well, okay, that's reactive. And you're just flying, from one disaster to the next. Whereas if it's, oh, well, we did an FMEA and we know that these things are priorities, and so we're going to add a little more resources to that. One thing's really uncertain, we're going to do some testing on that, and we're rarely surprised. When was the last time a customer called and it was all hands on deck, and they all had to think about it, and they said, that was a long time ago. No, that was in a different company. We don't do that here. Very different characteristic to how they make decisions and when and how they do it and so on. Now, reactive stuff, you've probably all seen many of these things, right? We'll fix that next cycle. I just hope to get it out the door, and not it's not my fault if a problem comes back, and so on and so on and so on. It's one of the things I see immediately when I walk into an organization in their design area. If the plants are pretty sickly looking and dead or don't exist, the office plants kinds of things, it's pretty good bet they're in a reactive mode, that they just are running from one call, one complaint, one field failure to the next, and probably doing them not well. And in some cases, they do it really well, yet they're working their tails off to go from one to the next. They cannot plan on having a meeting on Tuesday at 9 o'clock because they don't know what the morning set of field returns are going to have them doing. It's not a fun place to work. Unfortunately, a lot of people do. And it's really hard to get out of that. And we'll talk a little bit about how you go about doing that in the next set. Hopefully, this all doesn't look too familiar to you. Others get really good at it, right? They have whole teams of engineers that shield the design team. They might call them ongoing or support teams or sustainment teams or all kinds of other stuff that are staffed up just to deal with field problems or manufacturing problems to keep the development team shielded. It's a double-edged sword. It gives them time to do good work, yet they're often the ones that have to be involved to solve these more complicated or design-related issues. But it also shields them from what they did wrong. They don't get the feedback of what in their design process that they're not getting right. And so it's very expensive to have something like that. It helps, but it doesn't solve the problem. Now, proactive, um, I'll ask, so when did you have a recall or a surprise in the field, a failure you didn't know about? And they say very few. It's relatively rare that they release a product that they don't know what the top 10 likely failures are going to be, and those happen to be them. And they make a conscious decision that those are okay, or we'll deal with those as we can to further suppress those or mitigate those failures. We can't solve everything in the design process because of the constraints we have for budget and time frame and so on. Yet if you can consciously say, I'm going to work on this one, which will cause a 0.5% failure rate, and versus this one, which will cause a 1/1000th of a failure rate. If we think through what we're doing with enough care, we can do that. And we know what's coming up in the field. We know what the workarounds are. We know what to do with it. And customers are fine. They don't have big failures. They don't have surprises. And the design team is not pulled back to go fix a bunch of stuff that they didn't get to or didn't address. And so the idea is that when a team is proactive, they tend to do things very deliberately. And one of the surprises I had in doing all these assessments, because the going into the process was is the more uh, stuff you do, like FMEAs and halt testing and product testing and environmental testing and derating and stress strength analysis and on and on and on, the whole list of design for reliability type stuff. The more you did, the better your product would be. Well, that's not true. The very reactive teams that will do everything in the book, do every type of activity and do it every time and do lots and lots of testing, tend to have an okay field reliability, but not what they would have expected. They still are surprised. They're still reactive. They're still doing the recalls and all hands on deck and emergency type failure analysis type stuff. And it's because they're doing everything, and a good number of those things are just not adding any value. They're doing them because it becomes a checklist. And so we're going to do an FMEA, but we rarely take action on the top items. Or we're going to do halt. And well, of course it failed. We overstressed it. And then they don't take action on it. And so on and so on. Now, some are better than others, yet the idea is that if you're only doing all these activities to find disasters, you're going to find disasters and go about doing that. But if you do nine different activities and only one of them is yielding any real value to you, you're wasting a lot of time and resources. And usually that means that those resources are pretty stretched, that you're not doing anything very well. On the other hand, the proactive team very deliberately says, oh, I need more information because the environment that we're going to be putting this in has a bit of uncertainty of how it'll interact with our product. So let's do that test. Let's skip all the other environmental tests because we know from history, from engineering judgment and so on, that those aren't going to yield very much of any useful information. They're going to pass, and that's not useful for us. We want to know how this stress applies to this material in this circumstance. They don't do accelerated testing unless they need to do it. They don't do an FMEA unless they need to do it, that it will add value to their program. If you have a big Pareto of field, types of stuff and you're iterating a product, you don't need to do halt. You know what to work on. If it's a brand new material or subsystem or brand new concept, then halt might be a really useful thing and they'll decide to do it. So they actually do fewer things that we call reliability activities because it's built into the development process itself. We're thinking through and creating robust designs right from the start. So very few things in prototypes or in the field actually fail. And so we don't have failures to react to. And so you get out of this reactive mode by anticipating and designing out what could fail. And then when they do get failures, this is a hallmark in a reactive group. If you get somebody says, oh, such failed, well, who do we blame? What went wrong? I hope it wasn't my design. And now there goes the rest of my day because now we got to go solve this particular problem. And nobody, at some point, some cultures, it's such a burden that nobody wants to report a failure if they see it. This glitch is over here, but I'm not going to report it to anybody because one, it'll become my problem. Two, nobody's going to solve it. Three, we don't have resources to do it. And plus, it takes me 10 minutes to record it. I don't have 10 minutes. We're in a proactive organization. Any anomaly, not a hard failure, not a safety failure, but any anomaly is reported and investigated and solved because they know if they don't do that, they're going to see it again in the field. And they are literally seen as for the value that they actually provide. Failures are gold. There's no doubt about it. The ultimate part, the most mature organizations, reliability engineering doesn't exist. It's not anybody's on anybody's business card, which is archaic now. So it's not anybody's title. It's built into every engineer, every manager, from technician all the way to CEO. It's just how they make decisions. It considers the effects and the factors, and they know how to do accelerated testing when they need to. They know how to do this or that, the other thing. They can facilitate a good FMEA. They don't need a reliability or quality engineer to make that all happen. They may have somebody that has a depth of knowledge in reliability statistics or in reliability failure analysis, and they can use those skills to add a lot of value to the organization. Yet all of the other tasks and tools are just built in to how decisions are made across the organization. So that's what I mean by a proactive organization. Oh, and the office plants, they're thriving. They're doing well. And they're not I think plants react to the amount of stress that's nearby, or it might be the bad coffee. But it was surprising. I did a so many of these assessments. I was working with two organizations that were upstairs and downstairs of each other. Downstairs was very reactive. It was horrible. Plants were dying, meetings were canceled. They got interrupted for some emergency call frequently. Upstairs, it was quiet. The plants were doing great. People, made their appointments. I had great, relaxed conversations with folks. It was just enjoyable to be there. Their retention was off the charts. When people got into that organization, they did not want to leave it. And they protected that culture by reinforcing it with anybody that came in, that this is the way we do things and this is why we do it. And they could tell you that. Downstairs, it was, oh, you're here. All right, go fix this. Or, find out how this failed or do this, do that. It was jumping into a fast moving river and you can never catch your breath. So there are differences. There's one, the maturity matrix has levels 4 and 5, which are typically very proactive. And what 2 and 3 are reactive in nature and as a characteristic of it. And level 1 is they just ignore reliability. So it's usually pretty bad all the way, pretty random of what actually happens. So part of the assessment process is understanding, are you reactive or proactive? But more importantly, why? What's holding you back from becoming proactive, or what's holding you back from further improving the maturity, the approach you take to be very consistent in creating reliable products in a efficient, effective way, which is more proactive in my opinion. The assessment helps you answer this question. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But if you don't know what's holding you back and have the evidence to convince others of that, it's really hard to make a change. And moving on the maturity matrix can be done from anybody in the organization that can get it started. And yes, it takes the entire culture to change. A lot of people and their behaviors have to change. Yet if somebody doesn't start the process, it's just not going to happen. So how do you deliberately create the culture in your organization? Well, first off, you got to know where you're at. What maturity level are you in? And it's the matrix itself talks about training and failure analysis and design for reliability and how what the priorities are, the management team, stuff like that. All kinds of different vectors is what I would call them. And the idea is that the assessment, which can take as little as one day, a handful of interviews with people across your organizations to ask, so to what extent do you do halt testing? To what extent do you do ALT? To what extent do you do design derating and stress strength analysis and so on? How do you set goals? What are the priorities? An hour discussion with about 6 to 8 people will give you an amazing insight as to how your organization actually works related to reliability. What is your organization's reliability maturity? And you can map that to the maturity matrix and you can find, some things we're doing really well and some things we're not doing so well, but on average, it'll come out with one silo or one level of assess or of maturity. It's fine. But in that, you're going to say, oh, we really do derating and stress strength analysis really well. That's just a natural, consistent, and rigorous process the development team does. Well, that's great. But what about failure analysis? Maybe that's not so well. We just isolate the unit and send it back to the vendor, and then we don't really get much of any information and we don't really ever solve it. That's not so good. Maybe I need to fix that feedback mechanism, or maybe it's some other aspect, say the field failure data. We get a report of there were so many failures, but we don't know what failed. We don't have any failure analysis on field returns. That's a blind spot, and so on and so on. But by sitting through and thinking through how we do what we do, where the decisions are made and how, it'll identify missing connections between information or processes that could be better in the bigger scheme of giving you the feedback and information needed to make better decisions. If you're spending all of your reliability budget on prototypes and doing a checklist of tests that don't have enough samples and are done poorly so that you get very little information out of it, well, is there a better way? Yes. Which tests do you actually need to do? And so that's what I mean by identifying the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities is by spending a day getting the assessment done with your organization, you will have the insights to see where we need to double down and do things better or continue to do things very well and reinforce those. And then where the opportunities are, where are the options, so and so needs to talk to so and so about the how that information is presented or the types of failure analysis done. Or we need to update the derating guideline because half of the systems that materials we use aren't included in it. So we need to capture what we're doing and make it a best practice, or on and on and on. There's no one recipe I've ever found for an organization to say, oh, you need to do these 10 things to be good. Every one of them has a different list of 10 things based on what they actually do and where the barriers are for them getting better. And sometimes it's the general manager themselves. One of the very first assessments I did of an organization outside of HP, it was very clear the general manager was the problem. He was not happy hearing that. He finally came around and recognized that and then made lots of substantial changes in his behavior that enabled the team to start being proactive. They were just being reactive to the way he did stuff and the directives he was giving. And the staff was afraid to tell him, so they hired me to do it. So one of the hazards of becoming a consultant is that you might be the bearer of bad news because nobody else wants to do it. So I learned that pretty early in my consulting career. But the idea is that you need to know what you're doing now and where you're at, and then where those opportunities are. More importantly, is where the strengths are, so you can recognize and celebrate those strengths and reinforce them. And so you really are looking for what's holding you back. That question I asked a few minutes ago. But I also find that there may be all kinds of things you can do. And the reliability maturity ebook has a whole section. It's boring as great. I'll get out to read in general, but if you know where you are at, say with design for reliability tools, it gives you a set of recommendations to move to the next step up, to move to the next maturity level for that particular row. And it gives you a bunch of ideas or areas to consider, and then mapping that against what you've learned about your own organization will give you an action plan of how to bridge these gaps. And it might be one program at a time to make small steps, or sometimes it's, more the the types of tools and capabilities and training and types of stuff you have across the organization, or what kind of metrics and monitoring you do, and what kind of updates you get to it, how goals are apportioned, or so on and so on. Is some things are relatively easy to update or fix, and others may take a couple of years because the amount of capital involved to get certain equipment in place. Others may be a change in behavior, like don't send it to the vendor, send it to a failure analysis lab, whether internal or on a contract basis with a nearby lab. But what information is not getting to where it needs to be to make really good decisions? And let's set down a plan of how to fix that, get the right information to the right people at the right time. Now, the easiest thing to do is build on strengths. Sarah, your electrical engineering team is doing a great job with derating. It seems to be it shows that it's very consistent. We have very few problems at the component level in your designs. Yeah, call it out. Call it a strength, call it a great job, reinforce it, give credit where credit is due. And what can I do to help you get to the next level? How can we make this more efficient? How can we make it easier for your entire team to do? Is don't ignore what you're doing well, because those are the easiest things to set the stage that if you do good stuff in a proactive way, for example, if we make these changes, you will be recognized for it. And it depends on the person of how you go about doing that, but it's also part of the process of change management. It's building on strengths sets the stage that you want to be one of those that's a strength in your organization, so that you can get the accolades, one, or the funding, or the reinforcement that what you're doing is right, and that you can keep doing that. So it's the opposite of calling out the teams that aren't doing things well and berating them. I don't think that accomplishes anything except increase your turnover. So I think this is my last thought on this is, as you set out to do an assessment, you lay out in your mind for this program, in this reliability plan, these are the things we're going to do a little bit differently to make a change, a step towards improving the maturity of our organization. And maybe some steps at a more organization side for capital assets, or product, what do they call it? Life cycle documents, or just the way we focus on reliability in different parts of our system. It doesn't work by just changing the document. It doesn't work by just writing the plan. And even just implementing a reliability plan doesn't really change a culture. Remember, it's the decisions that people make. And that's a behavior we can't see. It's really hard to measure. And so part of it is catching people doing the things well, and recognizing when, we do a halt test and the mechanical team says, hey, we learned 3 things on that and we fixed those things. Well, then circle back and say, if you had not fixed that, when would you have found it? And how much more would it have cost to fix those things? And quantify that value, and recognize that team for changing their decision such that they then recognize that they did something well and that it made a difference. It had value. I mean, dollars and cents. Well, I don't know how many pennies we got left, but the idea is that by catching that failure now, it changed what could have been a 1% field failure rate to insignificant. And if we had a 1% field failure rate, even for the first 3 months, it would have cost us X number of thousands of dollars. But we avoided that. By making it visible, it makes the investment of, say, a couple $1,000s to fix it very worthwhile because it saved us tens of thousands of dollars. And use whatever units that's appropriate for your organization for that example. The idea is that it's good to say that was a good design decision, good job. It's like, so what? What did that actually save us? All right. And if you would have caught it late in the program, there's a I've tried over and over to track down the source of this truism, is that if you fix something in concept phase, it's almost free. It might cost you $1 or two because you recognize that I need to fix that problem, and it's just part of the normal decision right at the start of the program. I'm going to make the decision anyway, and so it doesn't really cost us anything. A few moments of my time to recognize that potential problem. Where if it's in the week before we go to start ramping up for production, we have components, materials, and processes all in place, and then we have to change them. It might take us quite a bit of an investment to make that design change. And if it gets to the field, it's even more. So the idea is that there are ways for us to figure out what's the value of what we do and celebrate those. For the folks that aren't up to speed yet, it's coaching, it's encouragement, it's reinforcement. Like reinforcement, if we're doing derating, we want to improve that. It's one is to look for it at design reviews of those boards. Did we do derating? How was it done? And so on. If we don't ask the question, it's not reinforced. If we're on a walkabout or we're talking to the engineering team, our engineers, it's like, how's derating going? That goes a long way for them to recognize that doing derating on your components is important. It's being emphasized. If you only ask, is the design done yet? Is it done yet? Is it done yet? They're just going to finish the design, wrap it up, and hand it to you. But if it includes, did you do derating right? Do we have vendors that are already in our verified, our approved vendor list? Is there any parts that are difficult to source or difficult to assemble? Those kinds of questions reinforce the types of decisions that they need to make. And if you don't call it out, it's obviously not enforced. If you only talk about cost or time to market, that's the only thing they're going to respond to as being the most important stuff. And then sometimes you got to manage up. What does your vice president need to say in the all hands meeting? Or what's the program manager's emphasis in making decisions at the overall program level? What needs to be updated in the design documents, the requirements documents, and what we pay attention to and how we're going to monitor it and measure it. And sometimes one of my favorites was there was a bonus structure that if we cut costs, and many of you have heard this before from me, and I've run into this in so many procurement teams, their goal as a entity within an organization is to reduce the cost of goods purchased to assemble your product. We reduce the cost of all these raw materials that we assemble together into our product. And so they lean on vendors, they lean on suppliers to reduce costs, to streamline, just go on and so on. And their goal might be if you make a 10% year-over-year cost reduction, you get a bonus. And almost none of those programs include the effect on quality and reliability. If they save 10% and get their bonus, yet we spend 30% more in warranty costs, did we really actually save any money? And so sometimes the metrics and goals we set create barriers for our decision making that are intrinsic into the organization. And so changing that bonus plan to say we need to reduce costs, but if you pay more for a component and it reduces the warranty, then you get a bonus. Wouldn't that make a whole lot more sense? If we're after cost reduction, let's not shackle them to only do it by what they can purchase from a vendor. Let's do it by the overall cost of that selection of a component. And you can see the difference between a reactionary organization. We pay too much for components, go make the cost go down, versus understanding the overall system and impact on the overall product that we're making and saying, you need to select the appropriate vendors such that we get the best cost for overall best costs, including the cost of failures, cost of loss of customers, and so on. So there's lots of ways to go about doing this and deliberately working with your team to reinforce and emphasize and coach and monitor and encourage and celebrate all of those things, even from a first year out of school new reliability engineer. It can set that spark that says, this is successful. Let's double down on it and then get some other advocates to help you do that, spread the word. That's what it takes to change a culture, is getting started and recognize that it is a change management process. Bring in as many other, folks as you can to help you do it. But eventually it can, and I've seen it done and I've done it myself. It does make a difference. Right. So the end of this and our year of webinars, I believe I've done 12. I don't know if I missed one this year. I think I had technical problems last year. They've maintained so far. But I wish you all a safe and prosperous coming new year and holiday season and with family and friends. I hope that all goes well for you. If you've got ideas or suggestions you'd like for future webinars, I'm in the process of putting together my rough calendar for what's on the calendar or on the ideas list for next year. I got one today on, thank you, Carl, for predictive maintenance. We'll see what I can do with that. And if you've got any comments or questions, like any of you that listen to the podcasts we do, we always are asking for comments and questions. I'll stay on the line here after this, but I recognize we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and shut down the recording and wish you all a great rest of your Tuesday.